One of the most formative and emotionally difficult cases that I was involved in was an eviction that was bound to happen just a few weeks before Christmas. And our member came to us, and it was quite late in the process, and obviously our member defence team got together, and we clearly saw that GHA had failed to communicate clearly with her and that she was in rent arrears based on no fault of her own. Also, in principle, no one should be forced out of their home during the winter, and especially around Christmas. So through kind of sustained protests outside of GHA's office and getting politicians involved to put pressure on GHA, we did manage to get into the room and negotiate a repayment plan with GHA and increased support for our member.
I think one of the cases that stood out to me was a tenant with a housing association basically was experiencing really bad damp in their flat.
They contacted the housing association. We no luck for 6 months. The member had lung cancer, so it was real like a real troublesome time for them.
Basically, members came together to write a stern letter to the housing association to make the appropriate demands to make sure that the member was protected and their health wasn't affected any more than it was. And it was successful. The housing association basically met all their demands straight away.
We did a protest outside Wheatley House, and we highlighted the fact that their CEO gets paid just under $400,000 a year. And we put posters up and we spoke to people and we highlighted this is what this man's getting paid, but they've put a rent increase up with their tenants but gave them absolutely nothing for that rent increase. No cleaning, no maintenance, no repairs, nothing. So we basically highlighted that to a lot of people who were unaware of it.
We had an issue where a member with a young family had a rat problem, and there were rats. In the middle of the night, this person's children were being woken up by rats jumping into their bed and crawling all over them. And it was a small flat anyway, it was too small for the number of people that were living there. And the rat problem, as I said, was so bad that the kids were struggling to sleep at night, like school the next day, because they've got rats literally crawling all over them. The person told me that the best way to describe it was that the flat comes to life at night in the dark. You can hear the rats everywhere. And this was a Partick Housing Association tenant, and we met with them and we said, this is unacceptable, this person has to be moved, you must have vacant properties. And we'd heard through the grapevine that there were vacant properties in the area that were run by Partick Housing Association. I said, this person has to be moved as a priority, this is a safety concern, and they were totally unwilling to deviate from the allocation policy, just hitting you with like policy. It felt really corporate. It didn't really feel like you were talking to a housing association, a provider of social housing. Eventually that tenant was moved somewhere else. There was an agreement was put in place and they were moved. But in that initial meeting there was no willingness to budge.
One of the first cases I worked on was this young guy, and he'd moved into a really nice flat, and he'd come to moving out, and the landlord had sort of jumped right on him and says, look, because of the damage to this flat, I'm going to have to withhold the deposit. The photos that the landlord had sent our member claiming that this was damaged was laughable. It was like, maybe a bit of cheese on the sink. It was a tiny little bit of mould on one of the corners, which is obviously, I don't really think, his fault. Scuffs against a couch, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that was it. It emerged that the landlord hadn't secured the deposit with one of the registered deposit safeguarders. He had kept it himself, which is a breach of rules that can be fined up to 3 times the deposit, essentially. So we could go then back to the landlord and say, look, if we go to tribunal with this, there's a chance you're getting a fine 3 times the value of the deposit. Let's settle this now, out of tribunal, and sort it out. It did end up going to the first stage of tribunal, but in the end, the victory came to us. I think the member got £1,800 in the end, which was a huge win for him. And more than that, it was also an apology. They wanted acknowledged that they'd been mistreated here and they'd been taken advantage of, and they got that acknowledgement in the end.
a lot of the times, if you have a member defence case, people are not willing to talk to their tenants. So Living Rent obviously have an approach where we're not afraid to take to the streets, to show up outside of people's houses, to show up outside of their offices and do direct action to make sure that our members get treated with respect.
There's different ways to put pressure on them. So large corporate landlord, you'd likely be pushing for basically attacking their sort of credibility on social media, leaving sort of basically making it really visible for them. Private landlords, I think, is a slightly different approach where you're maybe putting direct pressure on them as an individual.
We're not going to go away. We're going to keep pressurising until you listen to our demands, basically.